Today we're going to practice our painting skills with watercolor paint. I have my water bucket and I also have my two watercolor brushes. Watercolor brushes are different from regular brushes because they have really soft bristles. So you have to be really careful that you don't scrub these hard because they are more delicate than the other brushes that we usually use. I have a large brush and a small brush because if I'm painting a small area, I'm going to need a small brush to get those details. However, painting a big area with a small brush is going to take forever. So that's why I have a larger brush for those areas. Now, when I do my watercolor, I'm basically looking for craftsmanship. That means how well you're able to use the paint to stay inside the lines and fill in the areas. So we're going to kind of stick to the same rule that we've been doing for our coloring, and that is making the background black and white, and the numbers are colored. So we do have black paint that we'll be able to use for the background, and then any color that you want for the numbers. So I think today I'm going to start by painting in this entire triangle. Remember, we're doing one triangle at a time. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit. And I'm going to start with the small brush because I'm going to do some details in this area. So I'm going to put some water into the color that I want to use. And I'm just going to gently rub it, super gentle because remember these brushes are really soft. So I'm making sure that the brush is staying nice and pointy. I never press the brush all the way down so that the silver part touches, because that's how you scrub. I'm just using the very tip of the bristles, which is the hairy part. Okay, so now that I have some paint on my brush, I'm going to really carefully start painting inside the lines. When you run out of paint, you can get some more water and just fill your brush again. Remember, watercolor is supposed to be a little bit lighter. It's not like tempera paint or acrylic paint where it's really thick and bright. It kind of has like a transparent look to it. Kind of a see-through look. Okay, so just trying really hard to stay inside the lines. Just like that. Now, kind of a tricky part about watercolor paint is whenever you're painting right next to an area that you just painted, if you're not careful, the two wet puddles could bump into each other and they could mix when you don't want them to. So I'm going to show you a little trick about how to keep your colors from mixing. This is a real watercolor trick that artists use. So my next color I'm going to choose is this turquoise. So I cleaned my brush really well and I'm just going to get a little bit of the turquoise paint. Now when I go to paint my next area, to keep my colors from mixing, I'm going to leave the tiniest bit of white space in between my two colors. So that little tiny bit of white paper acts like a barrier. The paint cannot cross over that unless your brush pushes it. So that little tiny area of white is going to keep my two colors from mixing. I'm going to do one more color for you. I think I'm going to choose purple this time. And get a little purple. Get it from the edge here since that's where the most paint is. And now same thing, I don't want my purple to mix with the blue. So I'm going to keep a really thin line of white. So not only does that keep your paint colors from mixing, it also gives your watercolor paint kind of like a sparkling look to it, with those little white areas left over. If you ever look at professional watercolor artists, you'll see that they have a lot of little white speckles left in their paintings sometimes. I'm adding just some clear water to this purple to really give it a watercolor look. It's really light. Now sometimes you might want to blend your colors on purpose, and that's okay to do. So while this yellow paint is still wet, I can clean my brush, get a second color, and then I can sort of add that green into the yellow. Sometimes I kind of tap it, and those two wet colors are going to start blending and mixing together. So when you put wet paint on top of wet paint, it's called wet on wet. That's what will happen. They will kind of blend and mix, and you don't really have a lot of control over it. They just kind of do their own thing. Now, another watercolor trick that people like to do is called wet on dry. So in this area right here, this little pinkish purple area, I painted this a few minutes ago, so it already feels like really dry to the touch. If you want, you could take a second color. I'm going to use turquoise. And you can paint new details on top to kind of give it a more interesting design. So this time, when I do the wet paint on top of the dry, it's not going to blend. It's going to sit right on top. I'm going to give it kind of like a bumpy texture. So it has a totally different look from the wet on wet. Wet on dry does not mix together. After you've painted all of your numbers and painted your background with the black and white color scheme, you can move on to a new triangle to paint those areas.